The China International Fair for Trade and Services draws to a close. What are the regulatory and business legacies of this trade fair? First shots fired across China-India border in 40 years. How will India balance the border conflict, the pandemic, and the mounting unemployment? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Qiuyuan, sitting in for Liu Xin. Now today is the last day of the China International Fair for Trade and Services. Though the six-day event comes to a close, to those who are in the service industry, the event is just the beginning. First of all, it heralded a series of new regulations from the Chinese government that will benefit both the service industry from both China and abroad. And with a combination of summits, workshops, and exhibitions, this will eventually improve the international services industry in China. So joining us to talk more about the fair, we have in Geneva Professor Xiankun, professor at the University of International Business, and in Beijing we have Mr. David Blair, columnist, vice president, and senior economist at the Center for China and Globalization. Great to see you both. So, as the CIFTIS has dropped its curtain on Wednesday by looking back at some of its highlights throughout the event, it left us with some room to think about. Why don't I start with Professor Liu first? What are some of the major products that are being promoted at the summit? How would you consider these products beneficial to the service industry?
Well, thank you. Many products have been announced by the organizer of CFITIS. I mean, this includes 97 publications, 19 platforms, and 1990 innovations, and also the participating Chinese enterprises from all over China. I mean, they have also signed more than 240 something cooperation contracts with their partners, both from China and abroad. And as you said in your introduction, there are new rules, new regulations announced by Chinese governments. So those are all the good things that we should congratulate China and Beijing. But for me, the most important part of these achievements are the new measures announced by China to further open its service industry, including some by President Xi himself in his speech. This will definitely help even more the service industry than those other achievements I mentioned. For both those who are participating and those who cannot participate. This includes a nationwide negative list to administrative service trade opening, and also a pilot zone to be established by Beijing to test the new opening up measures on services. So I think this, the reason to say this is simply because many people have said, and many researchers have said, that China is falling behind in opening up its service industry. This actually has become a big obstacle for China to negotiate new rules, new agreements with their foreign counterparts, including in the WTO. And many things need to be further reformed through new opening up measures, such as less government intervention, less dominant or even monopoly status of state-owned enterprises, and low level the level of more opening up of key sectors as financing, so on and so forth. This has to be improved by what China has announced as new measures, and we need to wait and see. Thank you very much.
And Mr. Blair, let me bring you into this. We understand you have extensive experience working with the WTO. I mean, how has China done in connecting with global business since joining the WTO? And given that experience, how do you think will foreign investors be received when they land here in China?
Well, 2020 is turning out to be a banner year for opening up the Chinese services markets. If you just look at financial services, on January 1st, foreign firms were allowed to open futures trading firms, 100% wholly owned, and 100% owned life insurance companies. On April the 1st, they were allowed to own 100% mutual funds companies. December 1st, foreign banks will be able to do domestic banking without Chinese partners. So we're seeing a huge opening up of the financial services markets. In healthcare, we're seeing the Hainan Free Trade Zone will be completely open to foreign healthcare firms, and that is a prototype that may spread around the country. Recently, the China Finance 40 Forum, which is an influential financial think tank here in Beijing, predicted that a major part of the next 5-year plan will focus on financial opening up. And this is all part of a bigger process where the government in the last few years, essentially the last 5 or 6 years, has been focusing on market-based reforms inside the country and opening up to foreign competition from outside the country.
And talking about further opening up the service sector, here's a comment from IMF's senior resident representative of China. He said on September the 5th that according to one of the studies conducted by financial experts, the results show that some restrictions issued on foreign companies by hosting countries are ubiquitous and usually difficult to remove. So, Professor Liu, my question here is, what have you seen as the so-called restrictive policy, or what are they exactly? How and what would you expect to be seen in the future in order to loosen the restrict?
Oh, well, Mr. Stephen Barnett from IMF is very right. I mean, they exist in many countries, a lot of obstacles which handicaps the development of global service trade, and the related rulemaking on service trade is not moving ahead nicely. Many reasons are behind this. This could include, of course, the kind of status quo of the WTO, which is not moving ahead on many negotiations, including on services. It also means that a lot of governments are hesitating to open up services and so on and so forth. And geopolitical tensions also is part of the reason. On this part, China, of course, is not a leader, even despite what our colleagues have just explained about new measures here. But in terms of global rulemaking, that China is not a leader. And on many aspects, if you look at, be it what China has been doing in multilaterally in the WTO or bilaterally through various free trade agreements, the service part is always a weak point. That's where China needs to further strengthen. This explains also why China is a bigger service player. I mean, China is number 2 all over the world. But China is not a strong player, because if you look at many aspects of service trade, that be it on the percentage of service in total foreign trade, the percentage of the employment numbers, and also the percentage of service in terms of GDP. All this explains China is falling behind many other developed countries, but also smaller developing countries like Singapore, Chile, so on and so forth. So what I would like to see in the near future, of course, we want to see that China will concretely implement these measures to further open its service trade and to better improve its domestic regulation, everything, and also by participating actively in multilateral and bilateral agreements, the rulemaking, so as to lock in those progress, those new commitments China has made into these agreements, so as to improve the global rulemaking. Of course, on the WTO side, we are right now trying to select a new DG, and also we are waiting for some major players to come back to the WTO, and hopefully that in the not too long future that we'll see an improvement in the WTO. And the negotiations could move ahead in rulemaking on this global service trade. Thank you.
Mr. Blair, let me also get your take on what's been said by Mr. Stephen Barnett on the restrictive policy when it comes to opening up the service sector, because it is said that opening up the service sector may pose more risk than opening up other sectors, such as traditional manufacturing. That is why China is taking this process as a gradual step rather than letting it happen overnight. How are you looking at this?
Well, I think that makes sense. First of all, I wanted to say it's hard enough for a foreign company to localize goods sales within a country. It's even harder to localize services sales, to create the kinds of products, service products that people want to buy. And China is a very competitive market, so a lot of the complaints are the fact that the companies are having a hard time competing here because it's such a competitive market. But there are certainly risks to opening up services markets, particularly the financial services markets. Banks in general are dangerous things. So they can do If banks are out of control, they can do a lot of damage to an economy. And it's difficult to regulate adequately foreign banks. We saw this in the global financial crisis of 2008. There were lots of causes of it, but one of the big causes was the collapse of AIG. And AIG is an American insurance company that was selling a financial product, credit default swaps, from its London office, mostly selling them to European banks. So what happened was the U.S. federal authorities did not regulate AIG because it is an insurance company. It's regulated by New York State, not the federal government. London did not regulate the London office because it's an American company, and they assumed the U.S. authorities were regulating it. And the Europeans weren't regulating it at all. So it's very difficult. It's easy for a foreign company to fall through the gaps and create products that can cause very serious financial difficulties. So I think it's wise to proceed slowly with opening up the financial markets. And I'm sure that I know the authorities here understand this very clearly, and they're taking serious regulatory steps. But on the other hand, as I said earlier, there are big changes happening this year, big steps in opening up the market. We'll see how strongly the foreign banks are able to compete here, because it's as I said, it's a highly competitive market, and they'll have to find products that people want to buy and want to use.
That's very true. And Professor Liu, let's take a look at some of the comments on the risks of opening up the service sector. Now, while China and the U.S. are still planning to have another round of trade talks, during Phase 1 agreement, the U.S. government issued a statement asking China to remove restrictions on investment, reduce burdensome regulation, and to review pending license applications of U.S. companies in its domestic banking, credit rating, electronic payments, asset management, insurance, and securities industries. Quickly followed by a quotation by Lester Ross, chair of the policy committee of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, said that the trade between the U.S. and China is moving in a good direction. It doesn't go nearly far enough. He implies that China is not open enough for taking U.S. companies. And now there's a rebuttal. Zhang Wei, the vice president of the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation at the Ministry of Commerce of China here, said that opening up in service industry may cause higher risks compared with opening up in manufacturing industry. How are you looking at this, Professor Liu?
Well, I mean, they're all right, okay? I mean, on China not open enough, I have already explained. On many aspects, I mean, China still needs to make further efforts on market access, domestic regulation, and new services related to e-commerce and service trade facilitation. On all these aspects, China needs to make further efforts, there's no doubt. On the other hand, of course, as Mr. Blair has just explained, new opening up brings not only opportunities but also risks, especially in key sectors like financing. However, so it is it has to be the decision of any sovereign state to decide how soon and how much they want to open up their service sector. But as far as China is related here, and as related to service trade, generally speaking, China still is not open enough, that's for sure. And that's why China has announced so many new measures, and which is music to ears of many people. The other aspect of this is, of course, that this is always in China an issue about political will. Because a few years ago, when I was still a negotiator on behalf of China, many times I heard from my colleagues in the authorities in charge of services always said, no, 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 we cannot do this. No, 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 we cannot do that. This is national security. This is that, including on financial service. However, if you notice that not long ago when President Xi announced in Hainan Island with new measures to open up China's financial sector, and then nowadays you hear many times the authorities, the ministers are saying that they're steadily opening up China's financial sector. So those are new things with a new political will. I hope that could continue. The other thing about this is that, of course, There are many complaints from the U.S. and China-U.S. bilateral phase 1 has done a little bit, and people are expecting phase 2. But for many people in Geneva, the multilateral people, the bilateral channel is not the most appropriate the path to resolve this. It has to be back in the WTO where better rules and more participating members has to be there to have a more global vision and more global result, and that will benefit not only U.S. but many others. Right. So that should also be something we need to bear in mind.
Yeah, the political will is there. Let's see how the implementation goes. Thank you very much, Professor Xiankun at the University of International Business, and Mr. David Blair, economist, vice president, and senior economist at the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you.